Happy weekend. I hope you're having a good day out there. And if you're not, I truly hope that it gets better soon. Welcome to May. It is officially Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So, very exciting stuff. I have some incredible guest speakers planned up for this month, and I think you guys are going to love it. You're going to love them. You're going to love the content. I also kind of want to start something a little bit new with my content and my episodes. So throughout the months, I want to have one episode a month really focusing and highlighting on someone really inspirational and motivational for that month's dedication. So, for example, for this month, it's Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So I'm going to have someone that is of that category, so on and so forth. And I think it'll be just really cool because how it all kind of started and how I got this idea was we just got back from a trip down to Montgomery, Alabama, and we went to the Legacy Museum and oof, okay, I had an emotional warning. My friend was like, hey, my buddy went through this museum, just a heads up, he went through this museum and he said it was extremely moving and he broke down in tears, blah blah blah, just a heads up. And I was like, all right, got it, cool, emotionally prepared. And I still went through it and it just kind of floored me. I was like, oof, it was so good, can't hype it up enough. I wouldn't even say, oh, if you're in the area, check it out. I would arguably say plan a trip to go see it. It's kind of like the 9/11 memorial. Like at one point in your life, I think everyone should go see the 9/11 memorial, whether that's in the Pentagon, DC, whatever. I kind of think that this museum is up there with it. I loved it. I can't speak highly enough of it. But where I'm going with this very long story, near the end of the exhibits, there was this wall of glass jars with sand and dirt, some rocks in them. And on the front, there was a label that had a name of a lynching victim. And so obviously, all of these jars in the dirt was from lynching locations and then the names of the victims. But what really got me was there were so many jars that just said unknown. And I don't know, it hit me so heavy because I was like, damn. One, imagine you living your life in just a normal circumstance. You live your life, you die, and literally no one remembers you. No one remembers your name. Your remnants just disappear, disintegrate into the earth, never really found again. And that's it. That's just it. There is no remembering your quirks, what you liked, what you didn't like, the good things that you did. Nothing. Just nothing. Just unknown. But then, too, the double insult is imagine what these people went through. They were freaking heroes. They struggled and they suffered so much and had such an untimely ending, and they still aren't remembered for it. They don't even get a name on a tombstone somewhere with a birth date and end date, nothing. It's just unknown. And that really got me because I'm like, these are people, right? All of these people had stories to tell. They all had their fair share of identity, and it was just all gone. And I don't know, it hit me so hard, and I feel like that's just the saddest thing in the world, that there were so many people losing their voice and losing their stories with no one to tell them. And so I thought it would be a cool idea to, like I said, one episode a month to just highlight somebody's story from that culture, from that realm, from that whatever. And to just tell their story, let them have their voice and make sure that their story isn't forgotten. All of these amazing people that have done amazing things. I don't know. I want people to know that. I think we need to remember that. So yeah, that's my idea. Keep an eye out for it. Like I said, once a month, so maybe the last week of the month, who knows. I'll label it with some cool, catchy title. I think you guys will really like it. But let's start with this episode. Let's talk about capital punishment, okay? The death penalty. And this is very much so inspired by the Legacy Museum, because they have a whole section of the museum and exhibits on the prison pipeline, essentially, and the death penalty and some of the stats, all that. It's wild. And what really kind of keyed me in, and I'm like, yep, this is accurate, but again, never thought of it. The death penalty is really just an ugly stepchild, if you will, of lynching. That is all it is, nothing more. And the Equal Justice Initiative is partner, creator, sponsor of the Legacy Museum. And the headline on the Equal Justice Initiative on their website, it says, quote, "The question we need to ask about the death penalty in America is not whether someone deserves to die for a crime. The question is whether we deserve to kill," unquote. And that is exactly how I feel. Like, for me, the sheer hypocrisy of saying this person is so violent and evil for taking someone's life, let me stand here on my high ground and do the exact same thing to them, but it's okay for me to do it because they deserved it. Like, that, I don't know. It blows my mind. Like, to me, a life is a life. If it's not fine that they took someone's life, why is it fine for us to take that person's life? But we'll go into it, okay? Because obviously there are a lot of racial ties here, but I've never seen how the death penalty argument could fly. Also, my perspective on this is that for someone so inherently evil, maybe someone entirely incapable of rehabilitation, whatever, I don't know, I feel like the ultimate punishment for them would be to live the longest, most uncomfortable life. No shot of parole, no benefits, no privileges, no visitors, none of that. And to me, the death penalty is not the epitome of ultimate punishment. I don't like the phrasing easy way out when it comes to anybody's death, because I don't believe that that's the right perspective on life. But I just think that if we're looking at the people responsible for, the most heinous crimes, terrorist activities, hate crimes, things like that, the ultimate retribution is not letting them die quickly. Like that, and I know that sounds so morbid and bitter and vengeful, but I'm thinking like, okay, if someone did something to my daughter, what would make me feel like justice was served to that person? And it's not the death penalty. So, I don't know. Deathpenaltyinfo.org also had, let me just say, the coolest, most extensive, and most beautifully organized website I'm positive I've ever seen in my entire life. It has such a clear, detailed layout, fact sheets, federal info, state-by-state info with year-by-year details, case details, daily articles, and snippets that they're posting. It is just incredible research all in one area. It's amazing. Anyway, let's go over some details, okay? So the federal death penalty applies in all 50 states and U.S. territories, but it is relatively rarely used. There are 40 prisoners on the federal death row right now, most of whom are imprisoned in Terre Haute, Indiana. 16 federal executions have been carried out in the modern era, all by lethal injection, but this is crazy. So it's 13 of those 16 total have occurred in a 6-month period between July 2020 and January 2021. So just boom, 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 back to back, which is kind of wild. We'll go into it. The federal death penalty was held unconstitutional following the Supreme Court's opinion of Furman versus Georgia back in 1972. Unlike the quick restoration of the death penalty in most states, the federal death penalty was not reinstated until 1988, and then only for a very narrow class of offenses. The Federal Death Penalty Act of 1994 greatly expanded the number of eligible offenses to about 60, which that is a lot. That is a lot of separate offenses that can all get the death penalty. So, and there are layers to issues with capital punishment, right? Many of which do have racial bias undertones or pretty blatant overtones, but we'll get into it. But let's start with maybe the most scary. And I'm talking most scary for the person on death row, for the judge, for the jurors, and that is innocence and error. And so as the Equal Justice Institute, or EJI, I'll just call it that from now on their website, they say, quote, "Our death penalty system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent," which I think we can all kind of agree to that. So there's some stats on here. Hope you're sitting down. 197 people have been exonerated and released from death row since 1973. That's averaging right around 4 people every year that were on death row charged with the death penalty. And then we said, oh, whoops, sorry, my bad, you're actually innocent. 4 people a year. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but again, if you were the person on death row, if your family member was the one on death row, and from the other perspective, if you imagine the guilt that would live with you for probably the rest of your life, if you were the juror or the judge that said, yes, this person is guilty, get the death penalty, and then you find out you were actually completely wrong and you just destroyed this person's life. Just sit with that a little bit. And also, this is 197 people that have been exonerated. Think about the people that weren't, but maybe should have been. But we'll never know because they're dead now. But I digress. 1,587 people have been executed in the United States since 1973. For every 8 people executed, 1 person on death row has been exonerated. So 1 in 8, but still, that's not a good look. And the same factors drive wrongful convictions in non-capital cases and death penalty cases. So with those, we're looking at erroneous eyewitness identifications, false and coerced confessions, inadequate legal defense. That's a big one. We'll talk about that in a second. False or misleading forensic evidence, false accusations, or perjury by witnesses who are promised lenient treatment or other incentives in exchange for their testimony. In death penalty cases, perjury and false accusations and official misconduct are the leading causes of wrongful convictions. A record 111 exonerations in 2018 involved witnesses who lied on the stand or falsely accused the defendant. In 50 of these cases, the defendant was falsely accused of a crime that never even happened. Misconduct by police or prosecutors, or both, was involved in 79% of homicide exonerations in 2018. Concealing evidence that casts doubt on the defendant's guilt is the most common type of misconduct, which does include police officers threatening witnesses, forensic analysts faking test results, and prosecutors presenting false testimony. And again, according to EJI, official misconduct is more common in death penalty cases, especially if the defendant is Black. Data shows that 87% of Black exonerees who were sentenced to death were victims of official misconduct, compared to 67% of white death row exonerees. And I mean, also kind of stating the obvious here, but just keep in mind, because you know I'm a fair girl, okay? A person doesn't have to be innocent to be wrongly sentenced to death. I think that's kind of the key thing here, is where I'm not saying like these people are innocent and they deserve to be on the streets. The intense pressure to obtain a death sentence and the political stakes for police, prosecutors, even judges, it can cause some serious legal errors that contribute to wrongful convictions and death sentences. This is from the EJI website too. In Alabama alone, over 160 death sentences have been invalidated by state and federal courts, resulting in conviction of a lesser offense or a lesser sentence on retrial. And trust me, we are not done talking about Alabama, okay? Just keep that one in your back pocket. So, the other really cool thing about this website is that for each category, sort of like all of the information that they have on this site and in the museum, they have a ton. They don't just say, oh, hey, you know, racial bias in the death penalty and in the prison system. Trust us, it's a thing. No, they have so many case files. This is everywhere. I mean, and it's cool because they have very explicit examples. So they say, hey, on average, every year, 4 people are exonerated from death row for being wrongfully convicted in some way. And then they show you, like for this example right here from April 25th, 2024, a Philadelphia, Pennsylvania jury awarded $16 million to former death row prisoner Jimmy Dennis, who was wrongfully convicted and spent 25 years in prison. Following 9 days on trial, jurors determined that the city of Philadelphia owes Mr. Dennis $10 million, and the two detectives who, quote, engaged in malicious or unwanted misconduct, unquote, owe him an additional $3 million each. Mr. Dennis was sentenced to death in 1991 for a murder he maintained he could not have committed, and in 2013 a federal judge overturned his conviction, calling it a grave miscarriage of justice. While awaiting his retrial, prosecutors offered Mr. Dennis the opportunity to plead no contest to a lesser charge and be released immediately. In pleading no contest, Mr. Dennis does not accept guilt and thus was permitted to sue the city of Philadelphia for police misconduct. The two investigating officers, Manuel Santiago and Frank Jazrepsembi, don't ask me, I don't know. They are awaiting trial on perjury charges stemming from a separate case in which prosecutors alleged they lied on the witness stand during a retrial. And this is from his attorney, Jimmy Dennis's attorney, Paul Messing. He says, quote, this vindication, even more than the money, is something that will help him better reintegrate into society. The future is now open to him in a way that it wasn't before yesterday, unquote. Which, I mean, we gotta love a good comeback story, you know? But it shouldn't get to that, right? He shouldn't be spending 25 years in prison for something he didn't do. That's insane. He almost died. He literally could have died. He was on death row. That's wild. I don't have to tell you guys that. You know it's wild. And now, let me also add this caveat now. 17 minutes into this podcast, but better late than never. The prison system in itself could easily be probably its own podcast, okay? Not even just a series. There's so much on this. There's so many avenues that you could take this. I am strictly focusing on the death penalty. Don't even get me started on, how we don't focus on reintegration in society or even rehabilitation for some of these criminals. Like, we just use them as free labor. Yeah, don't even get me started on that, okay? But besides innocence and error in the death penalty, moving onwards, EJ&I also addresses inadequate counsel because, again, as I'm sure you can guess, the death penalty is mostly imposed on poor people who cannot afford to hire an effective lawyer, right? According to EJ&I, few defendants facing capital charges can afford to hire an attorney, so they are appointed lawyers who are frequently overworked, underpaid, and inexperienced in trying death penalty cases. Capital cases are especially complex, time-intensive, and financially draining. Lawyers representing capital defendants often face enormous caseloads, caps on fees, and a critical lack of resources for investigation and expert assistance. Too often they fail to adequately investigate cases, call witnesses, and challenge forensic evidence. Capital defense lawyers have slept through parts of trial, shown up in court intoxicated, or done no work to prepare for sentencing. So, I mean, again, just put yourself in their shoes. I honestly, on both sides. I mean, we all know, if you've been in the military, if you work in healthcare, like a lot of these career fields, they're overworked, underpaid, underappreciated, no resources. So are they doing the best that they can at that time? Sure. It doesn't change that their best isn't good enough. And I was also looking into this because obviously, I mean, we all know Miranda rights, like, oh, if you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. But the quality of those that they are appointing for you it's not who you want defending you if you're on trial with the death penalty on the table. You know what I mean? Like, no one wants that. And few states provide enough funding, apparently, for the Capital Defense Council as a whole. And most death penalty states don't require lawyers to meet the minimum training and experience guidelines set by the American Bar Association. So they're literally scraping the barrel just, so they can legally say, okay, well, we did appoint you an attorney. Sorry. And leave it at that. It's crazy. Next issue with this, okay? The big one here, racial bias. Again, the Legacy Museum has an amazing display on all of this and so much info, but I just want to touch on some key stats for y'all just so you can kind of visualize it. Point blank up front, people of color are more likely to be prosecuted for capital murder, sentenced to death, and executed, especially if the victim in the case is white. Read Lynching here in every way possible, except they're not being hung and quartered and drawn and burned alive. It's lethal injection, electric chair, so on and so forth. But still, this is, I mean, I don't know. Like, if you Google definition of lynching and if you Google definition of lethal injection by death penalty, it's basically the same thing. If you put them side by side, the only difference is sanctimoniously assumed high ground. And that is it. That's the only difference I see. So by 1915, court-ordered executions outpaced lynchings for the first time. 2/3 of people executed in the 1930s were Black, and the trend continued. African Americans' share of the South's population fell to just 22% by 1950. But 75% of people executed in the South were Black. Now, in 1972, the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty because it looked too much like, quote, self-help vigilante justice and lynch law, unquote. And the court also wrote in Furman versus Georgia, if any basis can be discerned for the selection of these few to be sentenced to death, it is the constitutionally impermissible basis of race, unquote. Southern lawmakers accused the court of, quote, destroying our system of government, unquote, and quickly passed new death penalty laws. I can't make this up. Quote, there should be more hangings, put more nooses on the gallows. It wouldn't be too bad to hang some on the courthouse square and let those who would plunder and destroy see, unquote. These are proponents of Georgia's new law at the time of 1972. And I know that kind of sounds like a long time ago, but raise your hands if your parents were born by then. Raise your hands if your parents were grown-ass adults by then. Raise your hand if your parents were grown-ass adults that were voting and all of that. This was not that long ago. It was not that long ago. The Supreme Court at the federal level upheld Georgia's new death penalty statute in 1976, and a decade later, the court considered statistical evidence presented in McCleskey versus Kemp, showing that Georgia defendants were more than 4 times as likely to be sentenced to death if the murder victim was white than if the victim was Black. The court accepted the data was accurate, but it refused to reverse the death sentence because it concluded that racial bias in sentencing is, quote, an inevitable part of our criminal justice system, unquote. I don't know. I don't know how people can hear that and not get heated and absolutely tilted and also terrified. Again, this is a whole social construct right here that could be easily probably its own podcast. So let me not dip into those waters. Let me stay in this rabbit hole. Let me give you some more stats, okay? Again, from the EJI website. African Americans make up 41% of people on death row and 34% of those executed. But only 13% of the population is Black. So you can see the just stark differences in those percentages. It's wild. More than 8 in 10 lynchings between 1889 and 1918 and legal executions since 1976 have occurred in the South. That's more than 8 in 10. That's a big number. Again, keep that in the back of your noggin because we're coming back to it. Looking at you, Alabama. 75% of executions for murder were in cases with white victims. And so race still influences who is sentenced to death and executed today. I mean, Hopefully that's not a surprise to y'all. The data in Georgia has actually gotten worse. So people convicted of killing white victims are 17 times more likely to be executed than those convicted of killing black victims. In capital trials, the accused is often the only person of color in the courtroom. Illegal racial discrimination in jury selection is widespread, especially in the South, and in capital cases, thousands of black people called for jury service have been illegally excluded from juries. And that's, I think that, I don't want to say it explains a lot right there, but you can see where all of these massive issues are when you also see that the jury and the judge it's all white people. You can kind of piece together the evidence yourself there. But also, again, put yourself in their shoes. Whether you committed the crime or not, right? You look out to your jury. It's supposed to be a jury of your peers. That's kind of what this whole country was founded on. And just imagine looking out and just nobody looks like you. You're just kind of doomed from the start, I feel like. But what do I know? I'm not a lawyer or a judge, but what do I know? Southern lawmakers today invoke states' rights to defeat anti-discrimination bills just like they did to block federal anti-lynching laws. Regional data from all the states demonstrates that the modern death penalty in America mirrors the racial violence of the past. Again, just an ugly stepchild of lynching. But somehow it's okay. We just kind of sweep it under the rug. We just kind of close our eyes to it. Yeah. Listen, as you can tell, I get a little heated over this topic. And you know me, it's like sometimes it's so hard for me to see massive issues like this. And we know about it. We're aware of it. But we do nothing about it. And then also, I will admit, there are probably a lot of people out there that aren't aware of this, that simply just don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if a lot of the general public was like, ooh, I don't know, is the death penalty still legal? I don't know. Because you never hear about it, you don't see it on the news. So part of me is kind of like, okay, how would they know? But then also the other part of me is like, I don't know. This is why I think this is important to talk about this and to just bring this out into the light. Let's move on from racial bias in the death penalty. Let's look at arbitrariness, okay? Gotta love it. I love my grays and ambivalence and springs and falls and just in between nonchalant, non-committal. I hate it. I'm being sarcastic. I hate everything like that. But like I touched on in the beginning, many times the explanation or arguably the excuse for the death penalty is, oh, it's only for terrible people who have done terrible things and blah, 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 the worst of the worst. The death penalty is supposed to be reserved for the most culpable, but really it's inflicted on the most vulnerable, as we've seen already. So, a little more backstory for y'all. In 1976, the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment so long as it imposed only on people who, quote, deserve it. The court has since barred the death penalty for certain groups of people who are not culpable enough to, quote, deserve execution. At least 44 people with intellectual disability were executed before the Supreme Court banned such executions in 2002. Again, raise your hand if you were alive in 2002. Raise your hand if you were already probably in middle school, freaking starting high school, graduating high school. Who knows, 2002. That was not that long ago. There are people joining the military that were born in 2002 right now. And just think, before that, it was legal and perfectly valid to send someone with an intellectual disability just right to death row. That was still legal. Blows my mind. 366 people who were children at the time of their offense were executed before such executions were banned in 2005. Mental health experts estimate at least 20% of people on death row today have a serious mental illness. That's today. 20% of those. And I feel like the death penalty is this millennia, whatever. It's our version of the gladiators fighting to the death for entertainment in the Roman Colosseums. I mean, how is it different? We just put on a show of humaneness because it's lethal injection and because they're quote unquote evil people. Sometimes, if we get it right, sometimes. It wasn't until 2002 when the Supreme Court in Atkins versus Virginia barred the execution of people with intellectual disability because they, quote, do not act with the level of moral culpability that characterizes the most serious adult criminal conduct, and because their disabilities in areas of reasoning, judgment, and control of their impulses can jeopardize the reliability and fairness of capital proceedings, unquote. But because the court left to the states the task of developing appropriate ways to enforce the constitutional restriction, some states created narrow definitions that permit the execution of people who meet the clinical criteria for intellectual disability. So we love that. We're letting the states and the government and politics decide, again, who can die, who lives and who dies. We're not listening to the doctors that have clinical guidance on this. Oof. I don't know. I feel so bad for them because they can't, depending on their circumstance and their financial background, they can't speak for themselves. They can't hire someone good enough to speak on their behalf. It's just so sad to me. It's so sad. It's just bullying. I don't know. It kind of just seems like bullying to me. Another vulnerable, unprotected demographic here are children. So 3 years after the Atkins case, 2005, the court applied the same reasoning in Roper versus Simmons to bar the execution of children because, quote, juvenile offenders cannot with reliability be classified among the worst offenders. Their own vulnerability and comparative lack of control over their immediate surroundings mean juveniles have a greater claim than adults to be forgiven for failing to escape negative influences in their whole environment, unquote. When Roper was decided, 71 people were on death row for juvenile crimes. 2/3 were people of color, and more than 2/3 of the victims were white. Now, like I said, the EJI website has related cases for all of these discussion points, but they have a case linked with the headline, quote, court acknowledges wrongful execution of 14-year-old George Steiny, unquote. And it shows the mugshot of literally the cutest little boy who looks so freaking young and impressionable. And I'm not gonna lie, I couldn't even read it. But I'm not even gonna lie. I don't care what he did. I don't even want to read the case file because that's so heartbreaking to me. I mean, he was just a child and a product of his surroundings. And quite frankly, I don't blame him. I blame the system and the parents that failed him. But honestly, I can think of a lot of ways that the parents were also failed by the system probably. So I only put like 65% of the blame on them, if that. These kids are just kids. Like, how barbaric that we're condemning children to die because of something that they were coerced into doing. And also, don't try to say that they weren't. Like, whatever they were convicted of was not done on their own accord. And you can't say that they fully knew what they were doing. They didn't. If they aren't legally old enough to be held responsible for bills and mortgages and military service and freaking buying cigarettes and alcohol, they're not old enough to be making these decisions on their own. They're a product of their environment. They're forced into a life of crime by manipulative adults or for the reason of survival on the streets because, again, the system failed them. They see what they see and they mimic what they see. All they know is all that they know. Their frontal lobes are nowhere near developed enough. But you guys know that. Sorry. I'm acting like y'all are the problem. You're not. You guys know this. The court recognizes this. It's sad that it took multiple centuries for us to collectively decide on this. And that it wasn't until 2005. And another very vulnerable population is those with mental illness. And this one goes hand in hand with capital punishment for children and those with intellectual disabilities. People with mental illnesses are more vulnerable to police pressure, they're less able to give meaningful assistance to their counsel, and they're typically poor witnesses. People who have a mental illness that cause delusions are also more likely to insist on representing themselves at trial. Think Jeffrey Dahmer and so many other serial killers. They are prone to outbursts in front of the juries, and some are so heavily medicated, or they have a mental disorder where they appear to have no remorse, which then of course works against them, and so on and so forth. There's a greater risk that people with mental illness will be executed without review of their convictions or sentences, even though the law forbids executing people who are mentally incompetent. Nearly 10% of the people executed since 1976 have been so-called, quote, volunteers who gave up their appeals, and over 75% of those who waived their appeals suffer from documented mental illness. Mental health experts estimate at least 20% of people on death row today have serious mental illness, like I said earlier, and at least 10% of those people currently sentenced to death nationwide are military veterans, many of whom suffer from documented trauma disorders. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it hits home, you know? This is real. Like, these are ones today on death row. EJI believes that executing people with mental illness is cruel and misguided. Rather than executing people who are themselves victims of trauma, violent injury, or disease as a symbol of society's moral outrage about violent crime, we should dedicate our resources to providing mental health care and support that would actually reduce violent crime in our communities. See, that's why I like this company. They see the problem, they're acknowledging the issue, and they're actually trying to do something about it. They're actually addressing the problem. Lastly, EJI highlights the argument of public safety with the death penalty on their website. They call it a direct barrier to effective crime prevention. And after more than 3 decades of research examining whether the threat of a death sentence deters people from committing aggravated murders, there is no reliable evidence that they found that the death penalty deters murder or that it protects the police. The National Research Council of the National Academies concluded that studies claiming the death penalty has a deterrent effect are fundamentally flawed. Studies have shown that murder rates, including murders of police officers, are consistently higher in states that do have the death penalty, while states that abolish the death penalty have the lowest rates of police officers killed in the line of duty. Also, good old capitalistic society, people arguing that it's a better cost alternative. Wrong! EJI shows that the death penalty is far more expensive than a system in which life imprisonment without parole is the maximum sentence. Sophisticated studies at the state level show that the death penalty costs taxpayers more than life without parole. Republicans leading a movement for abolition in some of the most conservative states in the country have condemned the death penalty as an expensive government program that is ineffective in deterring crime. Which, how demoralizing is that? Imagine saying, hey, we don't want to kill people because it's too expensive. That's insane. Because that's what we care about, right? The cost, not the cost of a life. Anyway, I digress. Some good news. Let's sprinkle in some good news here, okay? I need a little pick-me-up, a little positivity. Use of the death penalty, according to EJI, and public support for it is declining. So that's good. New death sentences have remained near record lows since 2015 after peaking at more than 300 per year in the mid-90s. Executions have also declined significantly over the past 2 decades. Public support for the death penalty has been waning steadily. A record low 49% of Americans said they did support the death penalty, but this was back in 2016. Now, the Equal Justice Initiative, like I mentioned, they sort of headed the entire Legacy Museum down in Montgomery, Alabama. So they're very invested in this whole campaign concept type deal, right? Especially in the state of Alabama. I said it would come back. Here we are. And for good reason, okay? Alabama still sentences more people to death per capita than any other state. It also has the nation's highest execution rates. So let's look at the current breakdown of stats in regards to capital punishment. Deathpenaltyinfo.org, that beautiful website I told you all about. I'm not going to read all the states, but 27 states, along with the U.S. government and the U.S. military, retain the death penalty. 23 states, along with D.C., have abolished the death penalty. Now, 6 states are death penalty states, but they have a current gubernatorial hold on execution. I am not kidding. That is a real word. You can Google it. It's just how it sounds. Gubernatorial. It means that the state governor said, this is my words, this is not a quote, "No way in hell am I executing someone, but once there's a new governor, it's back on the table." So a nice little, non-committal, hey, I don't want the blood on my hands, literally the blood on my hands, but I also don't want to do anything about it, so I'm literally just going to punt the ball to the next governor, and he can do something about it. Or she, sorry, oof. You hear that? You hear that just sexist expectations? Anyway, I digress. The U.S. government also declared a hold on executions, so for our military members, in 2021, so that's nice. If you are curious, those 6 states that have gubernatorial holds on execution, that's like my new favorite word, those 6 states are California, Pennsylvania, Oregon, Arizona, Ohio, and Tennessee. Now, one last layer of this that I'm going to bring up is another probably often overlooked aspect, and that's the burden of execution that's put on the actual executioners, okay? The ones having to put in the needle and push the meds. An April 28th, 2024 report by Ed Pilkington in The Guardian chronicles the trauma experienced by prison officials assigned to carry out executions. Oklahoma correctional officers asked Attorney General Gretner Drummond to slow the pace of executions, citing, quote, lasting trauma, unquote, PTSD, and alcohol abuse among staff due to frequent executions in the state. Former Corrections Director Justin Jones told Mr. Pilkington, quote, "It affects your mental state when it becomes so routine to perform executions," unquote. When Attorney General Drummond brought the request to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, Judge Gary Lumpkin told officials that the correctional staff tasked with carrying out executions need to, quote, suck it up and, quote, man up, unquote. I can't believe that this is real. Like, I can't imagine saying that to anybody. I can't believe, here's the bigger thing. I can't believe that this guy is still a judge. I can't believe that he hasn't been publicly just crucified for that. Like, what the actual, If I ever saw Judge Gary Lumpkin, he would be a lump, okay? He sounds like a lump. Anyway, the article continues on to quote Missouri prison officials, more than 60 of whom sought clemency for prisoner Brian Dorsey. Governor Mike Parson rejected their pleas and allowed Mr. Dorsey to be executed on April 9th, 2024. Tim Lancaster, a retired corrections officer, said, quote, "You're working with a prisoner for 10 years, you've interacted with them every single day, and you can feel they've changed. They've really rehabilitated, and that's the department's goal, to rehabilitate offenders. All of a sudden, they flip the switch, and now it's like, okay, we're going ahead and killing them. There has to be an underlying effect from that, without a doubt," unquote. And that just breaks my heart. So, yeah, I don't know. If this doesn't move y'all, if this doesn't make you think differently of our prison system, of our criminal judicial system, I don't know what will. I don't know what will. But I thought that this was a very important message to get across to y'all and to share with you guys. And also some of these, like I said, I like that they do have the case files in some of these websites so you can actually read about it, especially the current ones, because again, this is real, right? This is happening. This happened April 9th, this last one with Brian Dorsey. And so it's just, it's insane. It's insane to me. All right, on a lighter note, sorry guys, let me flip this back around for y'all, okay? I'm really excited for this upcoming month. I am so excited for you guys to hear what I have in store for y'all. And as always, make good choices, be a decent human being, take care of each other, be compassionate of other humans, please. I don't think that any of us are in a place where we can judge whether someone else should live or die. I don't think that's our place. That's not our role. And I think we should leave it at that. I think we should stop killing people. And yeah, honestly, be a decent human being, make good choices, take care of each other. I think that sums up everything. I will catch y'all next time. Okay, bye!